Welcome back to Air Quality Matters and our first episode of 2026. I'm Simon Jones, and coming up, a conversation with John O'Connor, former chair of the Housing Commission in Ireland, and Neil Freshwater, Public Affairs Manager for GB and Ireland. Just before Christmas, I attended a Healthy Homes Ireland event in Dublin. The purpose was to discuss how Ireland balances the urgent need to build more affordable homes at pace and against achieving greener and healthier homes. The government has now published its new housing plan. The European Commission was due to publish the first ever European Affordable Housing Plan in the coming weeks, and Ireland is obliged to transpose the revised energy performance of building directives into national law by May 2026. The event provided an opportunity to discuss these important developments in Ireland and European housing policy, and how we ensure that a holistic approach is applied to the delivery of affordable and sustainable homes in Ireland, one that also considers the health and well-being of occupants. The audience of around 60 guests included politicians, civil and public servants from relevant government departments and agencies, as well as industry leaders from housing and construction, engineering, architecture, public health, the environment and academia, and me. I sat down with John and Neil to discuss the themes of the day, from managing the need for housing with quality and affordability, and about how air quality and health stitches into this piece, or it doesn't. The crisis we face with child homelessness in Ireland, skills and labour, and more besides. Healthy Homes Ireland, for those who don't know it, is an initiative between the Irish Green Building Council and Velux, which aims to raise awareness of the link between good health and good quality housing in Ireland. It's chaired by Susan Vickers, Head of Environmental Sustainability at Clwyd Housing, and led by a high-level steering group. Following the launch of their report, Our Place Towards Healthier, Greener Homes, in 2023, they've been embarking on a campaign to advocate for policy measures arising from the report's recommendations that will help to achieve healthy homes. So this is smack bang in the middle of so much of what we talk about on the podcast. This is where the rubber hits the road. How do we make homes affordable, build them fast enough, and make them healthy? I hope you enjoy the episode. Don't forget to check out the sponsors in the show notes and at airqualitymatters.net. This is a conversation with John O'Connor and Neil Freshwater. We'll start with yourself, John. Maybe explain a little bit about who you are and what you do, or what you've done.
I'm John O'Connor. I chaired the Housing Commission, where we looked at the whole housing system in Ireland, but particularly in terms of delivering homes and delivering homes that are healthy and are of good quality to people. That's the basic aim of the Housing Commission. I've been working in housing for a long time. I was a chief executive of the Housing Agency, and prior to that, the Affordable Homes Partnership, and been very involved in relation to the regulation, to ensure that our housing is of an appropriate standard, and it's, at the end of the day, it's homes for people and families.
And was the Commission something that was set up for just a period of time? Does it still exist today and still delivering output?
The Housing Commission, was specifically for a period of time. We worked for two years to a specific terms of reference, what the government set out, and delivered a report on our various reports then in relation to housing. What we did do was set out a plan, for the medium long term housing system in Ireland, and our recommendations were structured so that you could read them today, in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 20 years' time. The recommendations still stand.
I think listeners from Ireland will have a good idea why a commission was needed, and that we've been struggling with housing here for quite some time. We've been through some fairly traumatic events when it comes to crashes and the delivery and supply of housing. What was the broad context that the commission was set up under? Was it about delivering numbers purely, or was it about the quality and the consistency of the stock that was being produced?
One aspect was the delivery and the need, for housing in terms of numbers. So the Commission, was looking at that, because we have got a housing crisis in Ireland because of the lack of housing for particularly those in their 20s and 30s, and people on low income. And so we were looking at addressing those specific needs, but also lots of aspects of housing in terms of how do you provide housing that's affordable for people? How do you provide housing that's of a good quality? That healthy housing. How do you deal with rural housing? In terms of what do rural communities need, and in terms of the various interventions, that the state might take or the government might take in relation to housing. What should they be? To creating a more consistent and sustainable housing system in the future.
So somebody that's looked at this from a kind of a top down, from a Commission's perspective, you see there are clear roadmaps and steps that can be put into place if there's the political will and the economic flow and all that stuff that goes with it. But as far as you're concerned, there are roadmaps and stepping stones to getting to a better place from a housing. This isn't a losing battle that has to go on decade after decade.
Yes. Primary thing that we did state in the Housing Commission report is that having a home, is the essential element, of having a cohesive society. So that's kind of our starting point. And we keep emphasizing that, because you can, forget about that, and you want to provide homes for people. We had a lot of, various measures, to do with housing delivery, to do with integration, in our society, to do with older person housing, to deal with homelessness, to deal with the affordability generally. The one thing that we would stress from the Housing Commission point of view is that what we're recommending is a menu. It's not a recipe, not for picking and choosing. A lot are interlinked. For instance, in terms of housing quality, we're saying we need to carry out house condition surveys, because we need to be looking at what is the quality of our housing, what actions do we need to take, have we got issues with ventilation, have we got issues with the warmth of a home, have we got issues with the design of a home from a daylighting point of view and from the size point of view, and do they cater for different families, whereas individuals or larger families. And then we have to grapple with very significant household size change, in Ireland, but also in the rest of Europe, rest of the world. So back, in 1970, the average household size in Ireland was 4 persons per household, where we're very quickly going towards 2 persons per household. So the needs of individuals and the needs of society has changed. One thing that was particularly interesting in the Housing Commission's report was the meaning, what is the meaning of home? And it's about, a family or an individual having, being part of society, having their own identity, being able to take part in the community. And it was extremely interesting and very informative in terms of getting, a greater understanding of what the needs of people were. And also a huge need for integration, in society. And it's about communities as much it is as about the home itself.
Yeah, interesting. And how about yourself? Maybe introduce yourself.
I'm Neil Freshwater, Public Affairs Manager at Velux, covering GB in Ireland. And I suppose our involvement with Healthy Homes Ireland kind of goes back to our origins, and we had reference to Danish or Denmark quite a lot today. We are in fact also a Danish company, and our founder, a chap called Willem Rasmussen, who was an engineer, he set out to try and make buildings healthier. It was Copenhagen during the war, 1941, where there was a shortage of housing. And if you've been to Copenhagen, you'll see there's quite a lot of unused or quite a lot of attic space, the way the houses are designed. And so what our founder did was to go out and turn what were dark, damp, uninhabitable roof spaces into nice habitable homes. And his sort of vision was to create a roof window which was built to the same standard as a facade window. And I think the fundamental point there is that it's, we don't as much sell, people don't want a window, they want daylight and fresh air, in the same way they don't want a brick, they want a wall that doesn't fall down. So he said, ironically, knocking over a cup. So sort of, our sort of founding principles were very much on this idea of healthy indoor spaces. And I think sort of winding forward to today, in the last few years of Healthy Homes Ireland, we saw back in 2001 the first iteration of the EPPD, the European Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which brought in most notably the energy rating systems that we see in member states and elsewhere for buildings. But we realized at that point that it was quite one-dimensional. It was looking at the energy efficiency only. And I suppose at that point we sort of said, going back to our roots, and say, well, actually, we're all about the indoor environment. Energy efficiency is absolutely crucial. It's absolutely key. But how can we get back to those other elements like air quality, like daylight, like acoustics? And so we've kind of been, I suppose, for the last 20 or 30 years, very much advocating for the idea of healthy buildings. And again, it's about, as we've just heard, putting people at the centre of the building. This idea it's a home. It's not just a unit, as was used earlier as a term that we shouldn't be focusing on. It's about people. It's about homes. And so, yeah, we've sort of very much been in this space. We've undertaken a number of research projects. We did a thing called the Model Home of 2020, where we actually built houses across Europe, and we sort of said, look, can we build homes which are energy efficient in terms of the new directive and the energy efficiency requirements, but are also places that people want to live, with good air quality, with good daylighting, with good acoustic comfort, etc. So that's kind of where we are. And since 2015, we've been producing a report called the Healthy Homes Barometer, now called the Healthy Buildings Barometer. And again, we've done we've worked with various research partners to try and capture this idea of what is a healthy home and what is the impact of it, looking at it from a kind of policy perspective, from an economic impact perspective, et cetera, et cetera. So a few years ago, we partnered with the Irish Green Building Council, who we're very closely aligned with on this area. They have a product called the Home Performance Index, which is a sort of holistic approach to assessing a building for things beyond just looking at energy efficiency. And we came together and said, look, there's nothing really happening in Ireland at the moment on this space. And that, I suppose, from where Healthy Homes Ireland came on, because as I say, we were very heavily aligned in our sort of outlook on what makes a good building, what makes a good home. And so we came together on that. In 2022, I think it was, we launched our first report. So we worked with CBRE to conduct a study of Irish housing policy in quite a broad sense, looking at where there was opportunities for improvement, essentially, and that's what we have in our report today. We touched on a number of those issues today. For example, trying to get some cross-body collaboration within government. And then obviously today, it's great to be here in the European Commission offices in Ireland ahead of the Irish Presidency at the second half of 2026. So it's been a long journey for us from a business in this perspective. But I think the work that Healthy Homes Ireland has done over the last 2 or 3 years to put this, because it didn't exist on the agenda, it did in small pockets, but to try and bring it all together. And you've heard some of the voices today about the importance of linking health to housing, which historically was actually linked. If you look at, I'm not sure about Ireland specifically, but if you look at some other jurisdictions, the health and housing ministerial portfolio was one, because they were seen as being, inseparable. So it's a really great way of trying to sort of keep that thing sort of together, as it were, particularly as we've heard around when there's such pressure on volume to get numbers of houses built, and also on energy efficiency and climate change, which obviously is massively important. But again, we need to put the person at the centre of that, and that's really, I think, why ultimately we're here today.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things that Velux has done is it's been an absolute masterclass in the last few years of demonstrating the value of a product, not the product itself. As you pointed out, yes, you sell windows, right, at a fundamental level, but actually what it creates is daylight, thermal comfort, air quality, thermal acoustic properties. It has energy efficiency properties. You've understood at a very fundamental level the purpose of why you exist. And I think what's been excellent with what Velux has done is it's really brought to bear some really good concepts to the industry to define and turn into plain English what we're talking about when we're talking about these very sterile subjects of indoor environmental quality, whatever that really means, right? But you know, coins like the indoor generation has been hugely impactful. You know, starting to say to people, I can sit here all day and say you spend 90% of your life indoors, but that doesn't mean a lot to a lot of people. But if we start to frame it in plain English and say, we have become the indoor generation, that resonates with people and they go, well, yeah. You know, and at a fundamental level, indoor air quality, to take just one, is the largest single environmental risk we face as a human species. It has a bigger impact on our long-term health and well-being than almost anything else. So this stuff really matters. But it doesn't exist in a vacuum. And I think what's been interesting about today is it really lays bare some of those tensions that building healthy indoor environments have to exist within. And that's just the realpolitik of housing and construction in general, isn't it? I mean, to take just one of the themes from today is about pace. You know, this need that we need to do more, quicker, faster, better. You know, there's this need to hurry up. We've been talking about housing and housing shortages, not just here, but in Scotland and the UK and Europe more broadly. This is a problem that's going on for a while, and we've been talking about modern methods of construction and all of this good stuff for a long time, but still somehow we're behind the curve. Somebody coined it today about trying to run up an escalator that's going the other direction. You know, there's a task ahead, isn't there? Like at a fundamental level, we need to build homes for people, and we're behind the curve. And you made a really good point earlier that it's not just the numbers of families in a country that drives the need for housing. There's the fundamental demographics behind it as well. You're making the point, I think, earlier very powerfully about as house sizes shrink, that doesn't just mean they disappear into the ether, that you now need 2.5 homes where we used to need one, like, and they'll all have different needs. Like, so there's this thing this demand isn't going away, is it?
No, and we're overly focused on delivery. And delivery is important. We need enough homes, you know, for people. And what can easily get lost is, as you say, Simon, the internal environment. You know, when people are outdoors, they talk about the fresh air, they talk about the daylight. You know, and we forget that when we're indoors, we need the daylight, and we need that air quality. We need good fresh air in our homes, and we need a home, you know, that is, as we discussed today, a healthy home. And that needs to be absolutely, focused on. As I mentioned during discussions, there's been various surveys and some longitudinal surveys in relation to housing and health, because health and housing are very much, interlinked. And the single two biggest issues in terms of the health of people are daylighting and ventilation. You know, so having good daylight in a home and having good air quality in a home. And if you go back to the 19th century, the early 20th century, it was all about housing and health, and a huge focus at that time and a big concern was about air quality. You know, and they even described air in various forms in terms of how all the health issues arrived, or a significant amount of health issues arrived from air quality. I think we've forgotten that, you know, and when we talk about ventilation, we don't pay it as much attention. Actually, I was surprised. I was looking at Velux's brochures, you know, there and a huge focus on air quality and ventilation, you know, and guidance being provided. I was pleasantly surprised, that Velux had that, that focus, and provided guidance, in terms of, ensuring that you have good air quality in your home, and how, the windows are designed to be able to provide that on an ongoing basis, and then what you should do from a use, perspective. But the coming back to kind of air quality, just recently, a number of people, I know, be it relations or friends, who are now suffering from serious illnesses as a result of air quality, in the environment, that they were living in or working in, and in a number of cases, they're terminal illnesses because of the air quality. Yeah. So it's really important.
And yet we do need reports like the Ireland's Healthy Homes report, to lay bare some of those problems, because I think it's easy to forget sometimes quite what a percentage of the population are living in situations where it's manifestly impacting their not only their long-term health and well-being, but sometimes even their short-term health and well-being. And then for every one of those, there are multiples that are kind of I always say this, there's a whole just getting by cohort in society as well. The ones that are mopping up the damp and mould yearly, but they don't quite make it onto an emergency list with their housing provider. There are people that are struggling with fuel poverty, like most of us have done over the last few years, with the cost of living crisis, that are putting general maintenance to one side for a while you're trying to survive and get by month to month. And the homes have deteriorated faster over the last few years than they ordinarily would. There's a lot of factors that are impacting the quality of home. I wrote down earlier, actually, when you were talking, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that at some level we've understood that shelter is a cornerstone of our needs. But I think the reframing, and this is what's been interesting from an energy performance of buildings directives, is this recognition that we're not just building boxes that consume energy anymore, which was kind of where the EPBD was, exactly. Right? Yeah. That now at some level we're building boxes that have a purpose. And from a home's perspective, that purpose is to create an environment for a family to flourish, to be an active contributor to their community, to be healthy and free from illness and disease, and be able to get an education and to work without getting ill. And buildings are there for a purpose. They're not just to provide a roof and to be sealed up and to consume as little energy as possible. And I think that's a narrative that adds to this trifecta in a lot of ways. We've got to build fast, we've got to build more. There's a lot of pressure to build energy efficiently, to build homes that don't lose a lot of heat. But we have to remember, and this is what's so important about these kind of movements, is that to keep health front and centre, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it is a challenge. I mean, this sort of dichotomy between volume and sort of quality is really difficult. I remember when we first launched the report, we were spending time around here visiting politicians in the Dáil, and I remember, meeting one politician. I forget specifically who it was, but I remember what he said. He said, energy efficiency, great. Healthy buildings, great, but if we don't get the houses built, we're going to go nowhere. And that's a real challenge, because politically, they know that if they don't build enough houses, the next generation are not going to, vote for them at the most simplest thing. But then people won't have a home. So you're really up against it. So it's very important that we have this report that's been sort of out there the last 2 or 3 years, giving us that opportunity to be able to sort of make sure it sits on the agenda. But it is a very difficult thing to get. I think what I'm saying is it's a political problem, and politicians generally can only work in quite sort of short 4 or 5 years ways forward, because yes, you might be building homes for today and the next decade, but what's the problem that you're going to have in 10 years time, 15 or 20 years time, either because the house is not up to a good physical standard, or because the occupants are having conditions. We heard earlier about an example. Sort of an exemplar development in Ireland, which was built in the 1930s, and how fantastic it was. But now, because it's not being kept up to scratch, it's having problems, and that's the political challenge. Is really when the realpolitik, as they say, is that they need to build volume and they need to build quickly. they're going to start, cutting corners in terms of quality. One example, if we can compare GB to Ireland, Ireland, I think, has actually been building houses better. It's been better at renovating. We heard earlier that Ireland, as a member of the EU, likes to be seen as the exemplar. But we're seeing requirements in Ireland to reduce or to speed up volume building, things like removing the dual aspects of apartment development, so you don't get the benefit of daylight or cross ventilation. And that's something the Royal Institute of Architects of Ireland have been very vocal about, and the sort of impact of that, because it's done on volume. Similarly with adaptability, Irish houses are built in such a way that you can adapt them up the way, out the way. But again, the sort of political pressure is to say, that's too expensive, it's too slow. Make it faster, make it faster. So you're sort of seeing towards what, to be fair, they've been doing, not as a badge of honour, but the way they've been building houses on mainland GB, kind of creeping over into Ireland, because they're sort of trying to push the volume. You can understand politically why, but as I say, it's really important that we keep there and saying, if you keep pushing and pushing, you're going to have consequences.
Yeah.
If you forget about the quality, by quality we mean design quality and physical build quality, and we're going to have problems down the line, and that's the real message we need to get home.
Yeah, and I wrestle with this. I mean, I'm at a global level. I'm in countries where the access to better indoor environments is an economic problem to solve first and foremost. That people in abject poverty, the decisions about their long-term health and well-being are luxuries they don't get to afford to make decisions on, frankly. So, I'm a realist in that I understand that there are pragmatic decisions that have to be made around quality and performance when you're in a scenario that is, frankly, at an emergency level in a lot of countries. And Ireland, perhaps you could argue, is in one of those circumstances. I think you were talking about earlier about the increase in child homelessness.
Yes.
I mean, that's something that at a fundamental level should be abhorrent, right? And should be an absolute red line. So if that isn't a manifestation of a crisis, an emergency, you start making the argument, or you see the arguments creeping in, that any shelter is better than no shelter, right? That any home, whether it's got dual aspect or whether it's got the best ventilation system or the premium air quality, do we care? Like, we've got to get kids under roofs that they can be safe and secure and dry, and warm, at a very fundamental level. So I appreciate there's that balance there, and I don't know what the right answer is. Ultimately, they're political decisions that get made, at some level. But interestingly, there's another factor here, isn't there? And this was touched on today. There's also the commercial factor, the investment and the real estates and the people that build homes. This has to be a sustainable venture for them as well. And that comes into play, doesn't it? And particularly we see that, you mentioned the UK. The UK has felt that probably more abruptly than perhaps Ireland has, that a lot of the decisions that are made about the quality of homes or where homes are built are based on commercial reasons, not on the need for communities in the right spot or the right type of homes.
And going back, you mentioned child homelessness, and it's tragedy, in terms of the increase in child homelessness. Today we have 5,000 children homeless, in Ireland. So going back 10 years ago, you would be talking about less than 100. So it's gone from a small no number, is acceptable, but it's gone to a significant number. And when the focus is on shelter as opposed to a home, so the focus can be providing a shelter, but in terms of providing a home and a home as being part of society, so a child has a home, can develop and go to school, can partake, in society and develop, rather than having to put their lives on hold.
Yeah.
You mentioned, talk about, the political cycles. It is a huge issue, and something that was identified by the Housing Commission, and many others have identified it, is decisions are made on, political cycles rather than actually looking at the long term. So the Housing Commission report was saying, what do we need to do long term? One thing that the Housing Commission kind of highlighted, again, many people know, is the lack of investment in infrastructure. Because if you're providing water infrastructure, if you're providing electricity, it takes 10, 15, 20 years to deliver something, of significance. But that's not, there's no interest, in that for a government that is only going to be in place for 5 years.
I'd like to borrow your attention for just a moment to discuss ACO, a partner of this podcast. ACO, an EI company, specialises in pioneering new technologies in fire, carbon monoxide alarms, and Internet of Things technology. Many know them as the go-to company for these products. In fact, this year they're celebrating 35 years in business. I particularly know them for their outstanding work in the housing sector with their HomeLink offerings, aiming to solve some of the industry's most serious challenges. The technology incorporates environmental sensors and a gateway to offer connected home solutions, which has a proven track record in helping landlords reduce operational costs and carbon emissions while improving residents' well-being and safety. Issues at the heart of the housing sector, like damp and mould, fuel poverty, and energy efficiency, are all in the crosshairs of ACO. I've been amazed at how they are innovating here, with a laser focus on unpacking some of the complex nature of these challenges in a way that answers the what next question we so desperately need at the moment. They have a great network of experts and installers. If you're in housing, they are definitely worth talking to. Trusted is an overused word, but not here. Ask around, and ACO are synonymous with it. Details are in the show notes and at airqualitymatters.net and at ACO. That's aico.co.uk. Now, back to the podcast.
All governments would argue that they're laying down plans for the next generation and all this kind of good stuff, but the reality is that there are these cycles of political change, and we can see that sometimes they can be fairly meaningless. You get small changes in government, but you also get unbelievable changes in political will occurring. We've seen that in the United States, for example, where within the space of 6 months, you can see the basic tenements and principles of science and community turned on its head, literally. So I think by the grace of God, all of us go there. We're hanging by a thread politically often that just a change. And we've seen this, particularly in Europe, with the need for, arguably increased security, how quickly funds have been diverted to the political, to the military industrial complex.
Yes.
Right? How money was found,
yes,
like seemingly out of nowhere to address a problem, and understandably so, right? But you realise how quickly big political shifts can happen. Sometimes we're not just talking about subtle changes of energy performance building directives over what seems like decades, right? That sometimes this can move quickly. And one of the things we've seen, and this was what was happening this morning, was the European Commission coming under a lot of pressure going, energy performance of building directives, great, but there's an affordability crisis going on here at the same breath. Like, it's fine going down this energy performance route, and for good reason, but we've got to build homes and they've got to be affordable. And there's a gap here. And that's, I think, what they were trying to address today a little bit, wasn't it?
Yeah, in terms of healthy home event today, they were focusing on, we need to be looking at quality. That we can get too caught up with the immediate in terms of delivering, but if we don't look at the long term in terms of what the need for good air quality, good daylighting, good warmth in a home. One thing I think has happened maybe on the energy side over the last maybe 10, 20 years, in most countries, is we're focusing on insulation and air tightness, and the issue of ventilation has been very much secondary, and air quality been very much secondary in terms of to achieving that. And there's also even a lack of knowledge. You know, somebody said, can we do natural ventilation? Can we do mechanical ventilation? And what is the solution? You know, what is the solution? So there's the biggest issue. There's a serious lack of understanding and knowledge of ventilation today compared to, say, going back, say, 20 years. So traditionally, you're looking at having vents, you know, wall vents. You're looking at windows, and you know, various windows you can open and leave open, small windows, big windows. But with the introduction of mechanical ventilation, and then trying to marry, permanent natural ventilation systems with mechanical, people have got confused.
I think that confusion point's a really interesting thing, and I think that's actually where there's a lot of lessons with the good comms that come out of organisations like Velux, because I think my sense of it is that we need to get back to basics somehow with housing and define what housing is for at a fundamental level, so that the world can shift around that core tenant. But at some level, everybody, from homeowners all the way through to the political system, understand what we're in this for. What's the point of a home? What's it supposed to deliver? And I think if you go out into the street below us here and straw poll 100 people, you'll get so many different results about what they think housing is for, from price increases to affordability to the number of homes to the fact that it should be secure to, you know, everybody will have different perspectives. But I think we've somehow lost at a fundamental level that the guiding principle of housing, and what that means is that these political pressures or these macroeconomical pressures that kind of come and go are shifting that core pillar somehow, and people are getting confused about what we need to do, what a home should be, because we should instinctively be able to know that in a crisis where we've got an affordability problem and a supply problem, where the bottom line is when it comes to quality. Like we should know what, regardless of what homes we're building, what that home should look like at a fundamental level. And I don't know if you agree, but I just get this sense that, and I guess that's why Healthy Homes Ireland was kind of conceived, wasn't it? Was that somehow we need a central tenant to what a home should be that needs to be defined in broader terms than just an EPC rating or a building energy rating, that actually the definition of a good home is this.
I agree, and I think, you know, looking at it at two levels, I think looking at, we touched on it a moment ago about the issue with ventilation and or lack of ventilation when it came to retrofitting insulation and making the buildings more airtight. And of course, that just sort of again talks to the point that buildings are systems. You need to take a holistic approach. You can't just simply, you know, seal up all the sort of ways the air gets out without you know, compensating for that. Otherwise, you end up with problems. So we similarly, I touched on the European Directive and how it just looks, it's improving now, but it just originally looked at energy efficiency. But I think that goes to your point about the sort of wider philosophy about what is the purpose of housing. You know, is it just is it just four walls and a roof, or is it about actually trying to make, you know, people thrive and not have the negative issues that can arise from poor housing, etc. So I think, yeah, absolutely, it's possibly, you know, a need to go back. It's people centered again. It's looking at that, but I think it's sort of seen as well, you know, nice houses, good design. It's just for sort of people that can afford it, and you know, you shouldn't, you know, that's not for everybody. You know, what they need is just a house, and there's this kind of acceptance that, you know. We touched on earlier about the idea of equality within sort of housing quality, and one person who I do a bit of work with, and she very much advocates daylight inequality. She's a daylight engineer by trade, but she says, why is it that people that have the cheaper houses live on the ground, you know, an apartment block, for example, live on the ground floor, and there's no daylight there, and those that can afford the top get all the sort of benefit, and that's often a regulatory requirement that says that X% of your development must be good quality. It's like, well, why? Why not 100% of it? Well, why is it that you can have these sort of cheaper ones? And there's some great terrible case studies of where this happens. But again, it goes back to that point. It's about volume. It's like affordable housing policy. You build your housing development and then you tack on the affordable houses on the end. Now, as you say, there's completely understandable pragmatic reasons why we do it, but we just, again, we think about everything kind of quite granular and specific without looking at, as you say, what is the purpose of housing, and we've maybe lost that. And I think that's maybe reflected also in the building regulations at a technical level, going back to the point around the insulation versus ventilation argument.
Yeah, no, and you do to be fair to regulations, see an increasing link between what we'd call Part L and Part F here, but between energy efficiency and indoor environment, in this case ventilation. So we start to see that. But for example, in this country, we've got almost no standards for daylighting, right?
No, and in terms of the building regulations, there are no daylighting requirements in our building regulations. Which is a huge shortfall, and even compared to a lot of other European countries. Even say if you're in Germany, in offices, you have to be able to see the outside. There's very specific daylighting requirements. Both in work as in home. Just going back, Neil, what you raised earlier in terms of health and housing and that link. And I'm just reflecting on it. It's been broken in many ways in Ireland. Local authorities, up to maybe about 40 years ago, they were responsible for health and housing. It's all part of the local authority. So health has been taken away. Before our building regulations, we had building bylaws, and they originally go back to legislation in 1878. And a lot of that was about ventilation, about windows, about openings, even about the spacing of buildings from a daylighting perspective. And then the building bylaws that we had, revised from the 19th century. The last set were in 1948. Again, a lot of focus on health, ventilation, daylighting, and a healthy home.
Yeah, and a lot of that was about communicable diseases, sanitation, public health.
And you didn't have electric lighting inside, so you needed the daylight because you couldn't just flick a switch, And
I think it's a curse of modern buildings and modern environments that the expectation has got to a place where we feel that buildings should automatically look after us. So our window of satisfaction has really shrunk. I've had this conversation on the podcast a couple of times recently, particularly in hot tropical climates, where they've recognised that with air conditioning and modern building design, the window of building control design has narrowed right down to a degree or two from a thermal comfort perspective. And actually people are less satisfied. And they've found that they've broadened that bandwidth and said, well, look, okay, actually the comfort band is between 18 and 26. And if you're warm, you need to go and open a window, or you need to have agency to control that space. Yes. There's just an assumption, I think, in a modern building that it's a bit like your car. You get in it, you turn the key, and then everything's just going to work somehow. And we're just not doing that well enough in buildings. So the assumption is people move into homes and they assume that the ventilation is just kind of doing its thing. They don't have to understand it or know about it. There's a kind of a trope conversation we have with people, with tenants often in homes. We go, oh, we notice you've got a heat recovery system. They go, oh, do I? And you say, well, yeah, there's a big box in one of the cupboards that you maintain. I wondered what that was. I just assume, so there's this disconnect between the building and the outcome. Yes. That it kind of goes back to my point about, I think at a fundamental level, we need to understand what a building's there for. And a little bit of that is we've lost our agency.
Yes.
The old days, it was, your mum came into your bedroom and opened your windows in the morning, and there was an interaction with that space because it had to happen. You had to physically play with the building to get it to work, right? Whereas now there's a kind of an expectation that you come in, you press a button, and shit just happens, right? In the background somehow, there's some brain figuring stuff out. And then I think there's a little bit of that agency piece has to come back into it, that we need to understand that we have some impact on our own health and outcomes, be a little bit more aware of our environments.
Yeah, absolutely. A family member who lives in an apartment there, the fire alarm was going off, and he was looking at, an extract vent or an intake vent and thinking, is that the problem? And not being able to distinguish between.
Well, I mean,
in the ceiling.
That's a good segue into one of the other questions I had. I mean, I think the interesting thing about our built environment, and I know Velux is involved in a lot of work where we're looking at monitoring indoor environments. We're moving into a space where we can actually measure and monitor the spaces that we live in better than we've ever been able to do before. In the UK, within social housing, there's a huge movement in the deployment of environmental sensors to manage not only things like damp and mould, but also to understand the performance of that building, to recognise fuel poverty or a whole range of other things. So we're moving into this space where these feedback loops starting to appear that we've never had before. And that changes the narrative on everything, because it's no longer good enough to say we built a home to code or to building regulations. You're going to be judged on the ongoing performance of that space at some point. And that's a different place to be, I think, fundamentally. It won't matter where your home is or what code it was built under. What will matter is today, is it delivering an environment that's healthy? And those sensors are available now, and people can monitor homes now. And we already see it. In the last half a decade, more and more people come to me and are saying, here, look at this data from my home. That never happened more than half a decade ago. That's changed. And I think that regulators and builders and the systems that deliver housing need to recognise that, because all of a sudden it becomes a consumer protection problem, that people are going, here, I bought an A-rated home. My expectation was it was going to be energy efficient and healthy. This data says otherwise. I haven't got what I paid for.
Yes.
And that's a different place to be as a developer. Yes. And I know several big developers in Ireland where fairly voracious WhatsApp groups have developed on a new estate, and all of a sudden people complaining about the comfort and the environmental quality of the spaces of the houses they've bought. Yes. Because off the shiny brochure, I was promised a beautifully energy efficient, healthy home, and it's not quite that. Explain, please. It's the same world that car operators have had to operate in for many years, where people are now going, well, this vehicle isn't doing what I expected it to do. Yes. Explain yourself, please.
Yeah, I think obviously with the smartphone technology particularly, and obviously the internet over the last 20 years, and as you've said, the cost of monitors is now getting, I think ridiculously cheap, where you can do it. And I get a sense that the technology is obviously now there, and we have some products that are linked to, to monitor indoor environment, humidity and so on. And we see little bits of it progressing. I know in Scotland, for example, if I'm not mistaken, they have to have carbon dioxide monitors in bedrooms, just as a kind of barometer as to when there's enough good air quality in it. But I think there's a big opportunity there. But again, it feels like it's sort of there, but it's not really sort of moving into the mainstream yet. It's a whole other, as you say, a whole other kettle of fish, because it's moving into performance gap territory. My building says it's rated B energy efficiency, and it should only cost this much to heat per year, but actually here's my bill. There's all these sort of variables, but there's no doubt about it. I know that there's a lot of campaigning work going in sort of parallel to this agenda around performance gap. But yeah, it's something that I think can help. I think one of the real sort of tricky things is about, particularly around user behaviour, is trying to sort of quantify a lot of the sort of healthy. Often we go into a room and we like it, but we don't really know why. And there are ways of quantifying it. I was chatting to a gentleman outside who who's sort of come up with a very simple way of sort of coding. I think he spoke earlier in the session briefly about how you can code indoor environment quality, to do a quick sort of check. But it is difficult. You talked earlier about building codes that set temperature, comfortable temperatures. Everyone's kind of different. Everyone behaves differently. I worked briefly in property management, and I remember a change of tenant in a building, and it went from being absolutely fine to suddenly being this moldy mess. And I was like, I can't just be the user. But lo and behold, it was just the user, drying the washing and not opening the window. Suddenly the place was covered in black mold in the space of a few days. So it is very difficult. But I think the education piece is going to be quite strong. And obviously that was one of the outputs of the Healthy Homes Ireland report, which the Irish Green Building Council delivered last year, was the sort of home user guide as a way of trying to work with developers and other people involved in the property chain to sort of try and educate people on how to manage a good home. It doesn't have to be a high-tech home. It could be an 18th century home. Some of the rules still apply. But I think, as you say, over time, because it's so easy to turn the heating on or to flick the light switch on, we've kind of forgotten how to manage the home. Because as you say, it's like your car. You expect it just to run. And we're all guilty of it. I'm the same, and I probably don't do as much maintenance in my own house as I should. But yeah, it's another one of these sort of challenging things we have to try and address.
It's a huge shift, in terms of the monitoring, because up to this it's been about, what thickness is your, from an energy point of view, what thickness is your insulation, what standard windows have you put in, and it was all about individual elements, saying, look, if you do this and this, you have an A-rated home or a B-rated home. And so there was some measuring, but very little measuring actually what is the end result here. What's the actual situation in use. So it'll be absolutely transformational, in terms of actually monitoring, what is, from an energy point of view, what is it like, from a sound, even transfer point of view, what the situation is, from an air quality point of view, what it is, and very importantly, like on the ventilation side, and we have forgotten about the importance of air quality, and it was discussed today, a healthy home, that not having the basic need of good quality air and the ability now to monitor that and say, well, actually, your ventilation system doesn't work, or tell us how to actually on a day-to-day basis, ventilate this home properly.
And it also addresses the skills gap as well, because one of the things that the assumption is because a standards exists, we think that the supply chain is going to deliver a product to that standard. That's generally been the assumption of building, right? And that was a problem in Ireland with lack of building control, and we addressed that with some new standards in Ireland about a decade ago that tried to make more of the professionals involved in construction more accountable for it. But we still find every time we go and look at buildings that we're falling short from a quality perspective. And there's an undeniable fundamentals problem driving that, and that's a lack of skills and labour in the workforce, and I don't know how fixable a problem that is, because it's a pan-European global challenge that you speak to almost any country in Europe, certainly, they're all complaining about the same thing, lack of skills and labour. So we have these plans to deliver better and more and faster and better quality, but with whom? It is a fundamental question. And there's a risk, therein lies a risk, isn't there? Quality can fall off where we start asking people that don't have those decades of experience to build homes for people that are going to have issues down the line.
Yeah, and when you change forms of construction, you change standards, that is problematic by its very nature, because say traditionally, if you're doing houses the same way, for that it suited the environment that people are living in, people can build up that knowledge and skills. But when technology is changing all the time, or forms of construction, people can't keep up with that.
That's a really good point, and we've been talking about this quite a bit recently. The constructions has traditionally been very conservative, and it's been delivered through generational changes. So you will see changes in construction types that will go over a third of a century, right? In fact, we class buildings by what king or queen happened to have been in power in this part of the world anyway, right? So that's how slow it moves. Literally at monarchy place, right?
Sometimes be very long.
Yeah. And I'm cognizant I'm talking to both an Irishman and a Scotsman when I'm talking about monarchy here. There's a joke in there somewhere and a bar usually involved. But that's the pace, right? And what we're seeing is, although it seems slow from the inside, painfully slow sometimes, actually the pace of technological change compared to how construction has moved over previous centuries is at lightning pace these days, right? Material change, the combinations of materials and technologies. These buildings are, in the context of how it's happened in previous centuries, changing out of all recognition almost every 10 years, 15 years. And that's a challenge in itself, is the pace, because you're not relying on that generational hand-me-down knowledge of this is how buildings go together. People are having to read them off of pattern books. It's kind of a IKEA instruction manual of construction development. These people are looking at buildings going, I've got to build it how now? Right, that's a completely different roof structure than how I've done the last development. And they have to readjust, and there's a period of change and so on. That's really interesting to see.
And I think it also applies at all levels. I mean, I naively thought that if an architect specifies a particular project, that it can just be kind of delivered, on the front line, as it were, but actually realize that you can't rely on everything. And similarly, if a government, if it's a government mandating a particular design, you can't just say, right, build like this, because the whole sort of supply chain, right down to the person sort of, put the door handles on, needs to understand that. And I naively thought that if you sort of did a top-down approach, that what you would end up with at the end was what the architect or, the policymaker could make. And I think that is a real challenge. We are, as you say, quite a conservative industry. I think some countries have slightly more, I suppose, we have, largely speaking, unregulated sort of craftsmen, as they'd say in Europe, or tradesmen, as we might say in UK and Ireland, whereas in places like Germany and Denmark, it's a much more heavily regulated area. There's a much bigger focus on skills and training and so on. So that's a whole other issue. So if you've got essentially an open market where there's no requirements for sort of standards and delivery, and you haven't even got a sort of baseline, how do you then sort of move them up? And as you say, it's kind of a generational thing. It's just sort of passed on, like a sort of folk tune. Now this is how you lay a brick, or this is how you do X and Y. And as you say, as soon as you make a change, it's something like panic. But my overall view, that's sort of the negative view. The optimistic view, I believe, very much is build and they shall come. And I think as you can kind of get the market sort of shifted around to these things, then they will start to improve, I think. We talked earlier about how do we make these things commercially viable, and I think it's about having things at scale, and government needs to sort of nudge in the right direction. The challenge is when you have particularly going back to GB, where there's 5 house builders building most of the houses there. So it's very difficult for the government to turn around and say, oh, by the way, could you build them like X, Y, and Z? And by the way, can you just still meet our targets? And again, it goes back to that point. But fundamentally, I think there needs to be if there's a constant direction, I think that's good. So I think the ask to policymakers is to give some sort of consistency. If I could use just briefly the retrofit example, we've seen examples of sort of quite sort of stop-start funding for renovation, for example, and it just doesn't give that sort of consistency to allow for industry to catch up, and therefore, going back to your question, the next generation or the current generation to retrain, or the next generation to get up with those skills. But you're absolutely right. It's as I say, going back to my earlier point, I naively thought that if you just say this is how to build a house, it will happen, but you need to educate the entire supply chain and construction chain in why you don't block up, for example, the best one's the air brick. You'll see a builder just painting over or cementing over an air brick. If they know about a healthy home, they'll know it's not a good idea to paint over an air brick. It's there for a reason. So sorry, slightly long-winded answer to your question.
Yeah, as you said, the consistency is really important. That's vital in terms of modernizing or construction or taking advantage of new technologies. One thing I have found is people often forget about the lessons of the past. So there is maybe certain traditional construction methods or certain things that are done a certain way, and when it's changed, it causes a problem. So somebody has learned over the decades, how you need to do, to do something. I'll give you one example. Is we have issues with defective concrete blocks in Ireland, and we have issues with the stone underneath ground floor slabs in buildings, and in some cases our standards going back to the 1940s are better than our standards today, because they identified an issue, because at that time when this all goes back to the quarries and the stone. There was people in the quarries, and they had eyes on the stone, so they knew what to use and what not to use, and then so we kind of forgot that knowledge, or we didn't appreciate the standard said be careful about this material.
I really like that idea, that sentiment of localisation in construction. I mean, we know that plays an important part in the decarbonisation of construction, right? Local materials, local trades, shipping slate in from China and concrete in from Germany, and all that unsustainable stuff that had to happen and did happen is being re-looked at in different ways anyway. But there's also that development of local careers and local supply chains and local infrastructures to build up. A large part of the discussion today was about rural construction as well, that we mustn't forget, particularly in rural countries, that there's a whole segment outside of the urban area. So I'm fascinated actually by that local aspect, and you touched on it a little bit earlier actually when you were talking about that even the standards used to be and were managed at a local authority level. Yeah. And certainly building control was, managed at a local authority level. So in this world of globalization and this world of, modern methods of construction, the risk is that you don't think locally, and I know that's been a big thing of Velux's as well, hasn't it? Locally sourced materials and sustainable materials, and trying to think about how you make a product that not only delivers good outcomes, but also is constructed and delivered in a sustainable way, right?
Yeah, I mean, as a business, we've been trying to just literally remove the embodied carbon of our products, and we've done quite well on things like packaging and aluminium. For glass, it's quite challenging because we're working on some solutions for that. But I think your point is really interesting about the localization. And again, I loved you. I'd heard for the first time about this issue actually yesterday, and we have a similar issue, but it's to do with concrete prefab in the UK. But I heard about the brick issue, and it's really interesting, because they would be able to identify what was good to put under a house and what wasn't. But going back to your point, the solution has been, as you've said, modern methods of construction, i.e. trying to do as much off-site as possible in order to de-risk poor decision-making on-site. I think that's ultimately what they're trying to do. So the more you do in a factory, the less problems you're going to have. So it's an interesting point. The solution to that has been to do the opposite, as you say, try and mass produce everything. Notwithstanding, as we've heard today, some of the challenges that the offsite or the modern methods of construction industry has had. It's just for some reason it hasn't worked economically yet, and a number of sort of key players have struggled to sort of get there. But governments have been trying to push that as a way of, certainly from a sort of build quality aspect, try to say the more that they can sort of de-risk so there's less decision making by the people on the ground on this construction site, and more of it's done in a controlled quality environment in a factory.
Yeah, it was an interesting. I know there are people who are much more expert in the kind of modern methods of construction than I certainly would be. But we did see this this flush of failures in the UK with off-site construction, didn't we? Over the last couple of years of it just becoming unsustainable business, and a large part of that was the necessity of a manufacturing process that has to have premises and employees and consistency of production, and just the pure inconsistent nature of developing out in the field. And what they found was that very quickly their stocks filled up with stuff that they couldn't get to site, and production stops. And the way that those are financed, those kind of production facilities are financed, they got into trouble really quickly. And it was a fundamental friction between how a manufacturing process works and how actual construction works, and the vagaries of, this entire site shut down now because we didn't get the water we thought we were going to get before, or we now can't get into access to the drainage system, so this has to stop for 6 months. And you got an entire manufacturing plant going.
Then you need an entire warehouse to house your unbuilt houses, and it's because they've all been prefabbed. Yeah, so I wasn't fully aware of it. As I say, I was aware of the fact that number had struggled, and again we heard it was referenced today, but it was interesting to hear. It makes complete sense.
So then maybe to wrap this conversation up a little bit, I think without it being all doom and gloom, there's undoubtedly challenges, right? And everybody, that you only have to open a paper to recognise what a lot of those are at a fundamental level. We talked about a lot of that today, about the fact that we're behind the curve in the production of housing, that there's a constant need to improve the performance of buildings. There's an affordability element to this as well. But at some level, we've got to understand that we build homes for people and communities, and health and healthy homes are fundamental to this. We've got the Irish presidency of the EU Commission, is it coming up? I get the terms wrong. So many in Europe, Yes. Yeah, so there's an opportunity to, in those kind of presidencies, to put best feet forward and to really demonstrate that you're doing the right things with a lot of this stuff. If we had an ask of that period of time, what would you like to see Ireland doing, particularly to be best in class here when it comes to housing? What does good look like out the other side of a presidency when it comes to the kind of things that they should be prioritising and delivering on, do you think?
In some ways, Simon, it's nearly exactly what you said. What Ireland could do is go back, to ensure everybody understands the principles. A home is a home for a household, for people. It's part of the community. And the home has to be healthy. You have to have a home that works for people, because we often get into all the detail, but we forget actually what are the basic principles that we need to achieve. So one, if Ireland could get back to let's get the principles right here in terms of what we're achieving, and then maybe secondly, maybe to recognise then, modernisation, what is available to us now, as you say, in terms of monitoring, the quality, of air in a home, or monitoring the environment in a home. So in some ways, keep things simple. The other one then, and as Neil said, is actually consistency. If you have certainty and consistency, none of this stop-start. Like if the European Union, through the European Affordable Housing Plan, are saying, we put all this funding, into it to deliver more affordable housing, more social housing, to say, well, actually, Ireland can say, you need to have a continuous flow. Don't take an initiative that lasts 2 years or 3 years. Decide, let's do something consistent and certain and a continuous flow. And if Ireland, can get those longer term principles, and even going back, we did talk about the likes of Sweden or Austria or Denmark, or a lot of the Central European countries that, after World War II, they came up with, here's how we're going to approach housing, and they kept it consistent. And the key to a successful housing system is that consistency, and don't chop and change.
A multi-generational plan. Yeah, it's almost like you need it's almost like an output from the report, isn't it? You almost need a charter. Yeah. It's a fundamental tenant principle that people back behind, and an organisation behind that charter that helps deliver it, that pulls all of these these different disciplines together, health and housing and regulation and building control and everything, all with the purpose of delivering a certain type of home, a home that's fit for health and for people. What about yourself?
Yeah, no, I think so. And I think, the first thing is to say is, we've had the recast European Directive on performance of buildings, and it's now got IEQ, indoor environment quality. You said earlier it's quite a sort of nebulous technical term, but why is it there? It's because it's about the individual. We don't just have the indoor environment for the sake of it. It's there because it's what makes people, healthier or stay healthy and more productive and so on. So I think that's the first question, is to say, why is that there? And let's really sort of make sure that is converted into policy and language that people can sort of understand and actually deliver. But I think the other one is, and we heard this comment earlier, the European Commission doesn't have all the answers, and we can, I think, learn from other jurisdictions. And a lot of these solutions are quite straightforward. We heard earlier, there are some great technical whiz-bang solutions, but there's also dead simple solutions that have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Look around at best practice. Look at other jurisdictions: Austria, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands. And I think we heard again that Ireland likes to be best in class. There's a real opportunity for them to say, great, here it is. Now, I appreciate the Presidency will have a lot of other topics beyond housing, but I think from our perspective, we've got this directive coming. It's got indoor environment quality. The answers, I think, are out there, and we can really, Ireland can really make a go of it.
Let's lean into it. Yeah. I agree. And I say at the beginning of every podcast that we already have the solutions and technologies we need to breathe better air indoors. The roots of success is how we communicate and the conversations we have, because those solutions are out there. So on that note, I appreciate the conversation after a busy morning talking about housing. It was really nice to kind of round that off with a kind of summary and perspective from the both of you. So thanks a million.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Before you go, can I ask a favour? Before you shoot off to whatever it is you have to do next, or even the next podcast, if you enjoyed what we've been talking about here, please do spread the word and let's keep building this community. And don't forget to check out our sponsors in the show notes: Ultra Protect, Eurovent, Erico, ACO, Farmwood and Zender, all amazing companies, and without them this podcast would just simply not be possible. Check them out in the show notes at airqualitymatters.net, and do check out our YouTube channel. All this content is there, plus much more. See you again next week.